Because democracy basically means government by the people, of the people, for the people. But the people are retarded.
And the budget will balance itself.
Do I have to sue CNN?
Legacy doesn't mean nothing. I'm gonna die and it's gonna be over.
Vivek Ramaswamy for the Wamaswamy. It's a new day. It's a new day. As long as the retarded and extremist Biden government doesn't start World War III over freaking Ukraine with Russia, it's a new day, and we're about to get some bright times ahead. The soon-to-be infamous duo of Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk are about to head the newly created Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. This department will single-handedly be responsible for creating the most wealth and prosperity since World War II, as it's going to remove the boot of government from the necks of the people. And it has about a year and a half to do it, which makes sense, as you wouldn't want the Department of Government Efficiency to grow over time and become the bureaucratic mess it aims to dismantle. Let's get to the official statement. November 12th, 2024. Statement from President Donald J. Trump. I am pleased to announce that the great Elon Musk, working in conjunction with American patriot Vivek Ramaswamy, will lead the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Together, these two wonderful Americans will pave the way for my administration to dismantle government bureaucracy, slash excess regulations, cut wasteful expenditures, and restructure federal agencies, essential to the Save America movement. This will send shockwaves through the system and anyone involved in government waste, which is a lot of people, stated Mr. Musk. It will become potentially the Manhattan Project of our time. Republican politicians have dreamed about the objectives of DOGE for a very long time. To drive this kind of drastic change, the Department of Government Efficiency will provide advice and guidance from outside of government and will partner with the White House and Office of Management and Budget to drive large-scale structural reform and create an entrepreneurial approach to government never seen before. I look forward to Elon and Vivek making changes to the federal bureaucracy with an eye on efficiency and at the same time making life better for all Americans. Importantly, we will drive out the massive waste and fraud which exists throughout our annual $6.5 trillion of government spending. They will work together to liberate our economy and make the U.S. government accountable to we the people. Their work will conclude no later than July 4th, 2026. A smaller government with more efficiency and less bureaucracy will be the perfect gift to America on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I'm confident they will succeed. Now this is the kind of stuff that gets me up and going, if you know what I mean. Libertarian voters in America will be glad that they voted for Trump if they did so, because this kind of stuff can only be done through one of the big two parties, and a vote for the Libertarian Party would have just been wasted. Libertarians look at economics through the Austrian school perspective. This perspective believes in sound money, meaning a commodity-based currency, ideally gold, because maintaining the value of currency and avoiding any kind of inflation is paramount to this group. And a commodity-based means of exchange has been the norm throughout human history. As well, Austrian schoolers focus on the unintended consequences of government action. Many times, the goals that the government sets out for itself and attempts to carry out through the creation of new departments or expanding existing ones achieves the exact opposite. Vivek was an investment partner in a hedge fund and founded a biotechnology company. As well, he's a successful author. And Elon, as you know, is a serial entrepreneur and a chief engineer at his companies. This combination of men accomplished in the real world and private industry is what you need to engineer efficiency in the federal government and ensure American tax dollars are respected and saved where possible. So let's get into the weeds here and hear from the man himself and his perspective on how to cut down the monster known as the federal government. We'll look at his interviews with Lex Fridman and Tucker Carlson. Let's start with the September 25 interview with Lex Fridman.
Yeah, speaking of shutting most of it down, how do you propose we do that? How do we make government more efficient? How do we make it smaller? What are the different ideas of how to do that?
Well, the first thing I will say is you're always taking a risk. Okay, there's no free lunch here, mostly at least. You're always taking a risk. One risk is that you say, I want to reform it gradually. I want to have a grand master plan and get to exactly what the right end state is, and then carefully cut with a chisel, like a work of art, to get there. I don't believe that approach works. I think that's an approach that conservatives have taken for many years. I think it hasn't gotten us very far. And the reason is, if you have like an 8-headed hydra and you cut off one of the heads, it grows right back. The other risk you could take, so that's the risk of not cutting enough. The other risk you could take is the risk of cutting too much. To say that I'm going to cut so much that I'm going to take the risk of not just cutting the fat, but also cutting some muscle along the way, that I'm going to take that risk. I can't give you option C, which is to say that I'm going to cut exactly the right amount. I'm going to do it perfectly. Okay, you don't know ex ante. You don't know beforehand that it's exactly how it's going to go. So that's a meaningless claim. It's only a question of which risk you're going to take. I believe in the moment we live in right now, the second risk is the risk we have to be willing to take. And the way I would do it, 75% headcount reduction across the board in the federal bureaucracy, send them home packing, shut down agencies that shouldn't exist, rescind every unconstitutional regulation that Congress never passed. In a true self-governing democracy, it should be our elected representatives that make the laws and the rules, not unelected bureaucrats. And that is the single greatest form of economic stimulus we could have in this country, but it is also the single most effective way to restore self-governance in our country as well.
This is still, in my opinion, the greatest nation on earth. Still, the economy is doing very well. Still, this is the hub of culture, the hub of innovation, the hub of so many amazing things. Do you think it's possible to do something like firing 75% of people in government when things are going relatively well?
Yes. In fact, I think it's necessary and essential. I think depends on what your level of well really is, what you're benchmarking against. America's not built on complacency, right? We're built on the pursuit of excellence. And are we still the greatest nation on planet Earth? I believe we are. I agree with you on that. But are we great as we could possibly be, or even as we have been in the past, measured against our own standards of excellence? No, we're not. So is it possible? Yeah, it's really possible. I mean, I'll tell you one easy way to do it. This is I'm being a little bit glib here, but I think it's not crazy, at least as a thought experiment. Get in there on day one. Say that anybody in the federal bureaucracy who is not elected representatives obviously are elected by the people, but of the people who are not elected, if your social security number ends in an odd number, you're out. If it ends in an even number, you're in. There's a 50% cut right there. Of those who remain, if your social security number starts in an even number, you're in. And if it starts with an odd number, you're out. Boom. That's a 75% reduction done literally stochastically. Okay. One of the virtues of that, it's a thought experiment, not a policy prescription, but one of the virtues of that thought experiment is that you don't have a bunch of lawsuits you're dealing with about gender discrimination or racial discrimination or political viewpoint discrimination. Actually, the reality is you didn't bring the chisel, you brought a chainsaw. I guarantee you, do that on day one and do step two on day two. On day three, not a thing will have changed for the ordinary American other than the size of their government being a lot smaller and more restrained, spending a lot less money to operate it. And most people who've run a company, especially larger companies, know this. It's 25% of the people who do 80 to 90% of the useful work. These government agencies are no different.
To recap, when he's asked how to go about making the bigger reduction, he gave his two examples of cutting too little or too much. Now, he's very practical and says it's impossible to perfectly measure and cut, and that it's better to make the bigger cut knowing that you'll be doing more good than harm and assess from there. His approach would have the aim of a 75% reduction in federal employees right away and shows that he is interested in having a serious impact and not just pondering. I like when he tells Rex the point is not just to do relatively well compared to other countries, but to pursue excellence. He points out that with a blanket firing based on need, you can overcome civil protections that federal employees could use to sue to keep their jobs. He goes on to say that there would be an assessment for who knows their job best and has the most knowledge and respect for the Constitution to help retain the best. Great points. Now let's move on to his November 8th interview with Tucker Carlson.
And what I think of as the second mass deportation that we require, which is the mass deportation of millions of unelected federal bureaucrats out of the DC bureaucracy. And I do think that is what's going to save this country
But you
in the long
can't do
run.
that.
I think you actually can.
You can't fire. We
I
can
think-
all be fired. I've been fired many times. I'm sure you just lost a presidential race. Like we've all, the only group that cannot fail that has actual tenure is not Harvard professors.
Not even. Yep.
It's not even.
Yeah.
It's federal bureaucrats. No, Amy Wax just got, tenure is no protection at all compared to the protection of federal employment.
So the one difference is, first of all, we have a president who I think has the spine to actually step up and do it. But the second thing is we actually have and not to get too, in the weeds here, but we actually have a legal landscape with the current Supreme Court that allows us to do what couldn't have been done in the last half
But
century.
they have a moral right to work from home 10 hours a week at our expense at a far higher wage than the average American.
Oh, absolutely. So the funny thing is,
but they have a moral right. You can't complain about
You
it.
actually brought up a really interesting dimension of this. If you literally just mandated that they have to actually show up to work Monday through Friday, I know, radical idea.
They don't go to work.
Actually, a good number of them would quit that way. Right. That step alone. So you don't even have to talk about, you want a mass firing, a mass exodus. Just tell them they have to come back 5 days a week from 8 p.m. to 6 p.m. Like many Americans, most Americans who work hard to earn a living in this country, just show up physically to work. You'd actually have about a 25% thinning out of the federal bureaucracy right there. So that's an easy first step. Next step is, so the Supreme Court, what they've laid out right now is they've basically said, in so many words, that most federal regulations are unconstitutional. Close to in so many words, that's what they've said. If Congress didn't pass it, right? So basic principle here is the people we elect to run the government should run the government. That's not the case today. The people who write most of the rules were never elected to their positions.
And the Congress makes the laws. That's what the Constitution says.
That's what the Constitution says, but that's not exactly how it works today. And the Supreme Court, thankfully, has had a major problem with that. What they've said is, if it's a major question, if it's something that affects people's lives economically or relates to a major political issue, it cannot be written into existence by somebody who is not elected to office or who can't be voted out of office. It has to be done by the people who were elected to write the laws. So who could be voted out if they write bad laws? That's a beautiful thing. And I think that those were seismic
That's
in their
democracy.
impact.
You're describing democracy.
That's actually the essence of democracy. That's the essence of self-governance. Now, if you have 50% fewer regulations, that creates kind of an industrial logic to say that, okay, well, then we don't need 50% of the people around anymore either. And the way these rules have worked in the past is they have this, you know this well, right? The civil service rules, the civil protection rules that say you can't fire these federal bureaucrats. That's been the historical, accepted dogma. Actually, if you read the law carefully, it doesn't work quite that way. That applies to individual firings, right? To say if I fire you, you have a special protection to say that I either politically discriminated against you or discriminated for some other reason, or if you fire a bunch of people with discretionary firings, if there's a disparate racial impact or a gender impact or whatever, you could be sued on a million grounds. But if it is part of a mass firing, what you call a reduction in force, if it's just like a mass firing, those actually fall outside the civil service rules as they exist. So if you go in that order to say that, okay, the Supreme Court's already told us that all of these regulations, not all of them, but an overwhelming majority of them are invalid. You go straight down that list and say we have 50%, 70%, 80% fewer regulations. Then you look at the 4 million people, civil servants or whatever, and say that, okay, if we have 80% fewer regulations, then we need 80% fewer people to enforce them. That simply makes sense. Then you have the industrial logic for right there under current law, mass downsizing just the scale of the federal government.
Would you be involved in this effort?
I'd like to be. Yeah, absolutely. I've given it a lot of thought. It was the centerpiece of my presidential campaign. I spent a year and a half of my life. It was probably the most, I took a lot of positions on a lot of things, but this is probably the single most useful and certainly personally important to me part of the policy aspect of my campaign last year. And I have been involved, let's just say in recent months, in
this is
laying out what the blueprint should look like.
This is the draining the swamp part of the operation that we were promised but never got. And I know you've talked to the president-elect about this and many other topics. Do you think he's on board for something this far-reaching?
He understands this is the root cause of the cancer. He said drain the swamp for a reason.
To recap, when Tucker raises the concern over their job security, Vivek points out just force them to physically show up 5 days a week and 25% of these lazy government fucks will quit right there. But the main point is the Supreme Court has laid out that most federal regulations are unconstitutional as they're written by unelected bureaucrats instead of elected representatives, so the premise to consider many jobs overseeing and enforcing these regulations as unnecessary has been laid out. The beautiful thing is this approach would allow the federal government to shrink and relieve taxpayers of its burden while overcoming civil service protections. Obviously, Vivek is passionate about this oversight project and he was already consulting the Trump administration on it before being appointed formally, and he also has the highest confidence that President Trump believes in this reform and would back it. And of course, we can't wrap this up before we go to Vivek's partner in crime, the Doge man himself, the master of all things Doge, the one, the only Elon Musk.
I kind of like Doge. It's more fun. We just take a look at all the federal agencies and say, do we really need whatever it is, 428 federal agencies? Like, there's so many that people have never even heard of. and that have overlapping areas of responsibility, we should, I don't know, probably we should get. I mean, there are more federal agencies than there are years since the establishment of the United States, which means that we've created more than one federal agency per year on average. That seems a lot.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. So we should have, that seems crazy. I think we should be able to get away with 99 agencies. I don't know. That seems a lot like a lot of agencies.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot of agencies, alright, but it's about to become fewer and fewer. Thank you for tuning in to Harjedia's Takes. If you enjoyed this broadcast, I sure would love for you to smash that like button and hit subscribe. I'll hug you long time. See you later.